Alrighty. What are we doing? All right. Technique cyborgs. Are they dumb or is there some validity to it? I think that there is some validity on both sides. The bro scientist who uses a bit of cheap form and the scientist who uses incredibly tight form. I don't think it is black or white. I think there is a gray area here. There's a schism on fitness right now, or YouTube fitness, where people are arguing whether or not you need strict form, whether or not you need just like kind of lax form. I think it's in between. I think a lot of people probably get this, but I just wanted to add my nuanced opinion on this. And I'm going to go over the pros first, and then I'm going to go over the cons of being a total cyborg. And I think, again, it's a gray area. We need to combine the two. This could be a really long video, so I'm not going to spend too much time on each individual point. I'm just going to give my basic opinion on each one of these. The first one is standardization. Very simple. If your form isn't standardized, you will not know whether or not you are falsely progressing or regressing. If you do a barbell squat and you're not doing full range of motion, there is going to be a variance between squats on a daily basis or a weekly basis. One day you got 100 kilos in your back, you go maybe to parallel, dead parallel, great. Next session, you go a little further above parallel and you're like, wow, this feels really light today. I'm progressing. My training's working really good. When in reality, your training could be shit and you're just over time falsely progressing or regressing by going a little bit lower than last session. And you're like, fuck, this is heavy today. Did I sleep well enough or did I eat enough? No, you did everything perfectly. You just fucked your form up a little bit. Whereas if you just go all the way down, ask the grass, you know every time that if you are progressing or regressing, you're doing something right or you're doing something wrong. Simple as. And that way, you will not. Another example of this would be a cable row. Rather than changing the range of motion, people might start using a bit of momentum. Just the slightest amount of momentum on a cable row or a bicep curl or any movement will tremendously change your ability to lift that weight. If you can cable row, say 70 kilos super strict, you could probably cable row 80 kilos with just a little bit of rocking motion. And the problem there is if you could standardize that rocking motion, that'd be fine. Problem is you can't standardize that because then you have to emulate the exact amount of rocking every single time you do that. And that's not going to be possible. So one session you might be rocking a little bit, and then the next session you rock a little bit less, and you're like, fuck, why am I weaker? Well, you rocked a little bit less. Or maybe from set to set, you get weaker or stronger based off the fact that you're not being able to standardize your cheating form. So in a lot of cases, you're better off starting strict, and then later on with other exercises or things beyond failure, you start using a bit more cheating form. That's my number one argument against this whole thing, is that standardization is incredibly important to know if you're progressively overloading, especially if you're natural. So you don't want to get that one wrong. The next point is safety. Now, this is a no-brainer. If you lift with really slow, impeccable form with no momentum, you are far safer than the guy who uses momentum or a lot of momentum. And this is contextual. Are you old? Are you injured? Are you lifting a bicep? Have you torn a bicep? And now from now on, that bicep is slightly painful or maybe slightly more prone to injury. Well, you might want to consider doing bicep curls with that arm with seriously safe, slow rep speeds to make sure that you're not putting your connective tissues at risk. However, are you doing traps where there's a very unlikelihood of tearing your trap tendon? Do you have no impingements in your shoulders? Do you have any back problems? No, cool. You can probably do some pretty heavy shrugs. But if you are doing a movement that is inherently a little bit more dangerous, like a deadlift or a squat or a bicep curl with a previously torn bicep, then you want to take it a bit safer. You want to be more of a cyborg. If you lose out on some gains because you're not using momentum, which I highly doubt it, then so be it. Because if you do a bicep curl with cheap form and you tear your bicep, you won't be able to train for like 3 months. And even if you were getting better gains from those cheap forms, it wasn't worth it for the gains because you're just going to piss them all away with the injuries or nagging injuries. Even if you don't get full-blown injury, you won't be able to train optimally. Maybe you get bicep tendonitis because you've been training with too much broken down form and you're training your tendons more than your muscles, and thus your tendons can't recover. And now you can't train your biceps optimally at all. So it's contextual. I think you need to take safety in consideration in certain areas. You don't want to use sloppy form on a deadlift. Next one is the stretch. So if you are training for a full range of motion on a myriad of different exercises, you're going to get the weighted stretch. The weighted stretch has been proven to increase muscular capacity. It stretches your fascia. It will increase hyperplasia potentially. There are so many benefits, some of them You know, I mean, hyperplasia, we're not entirely sure whether or not it can happen in humans, but the way they've induced it in rodent studies is by stretching out the muscles tissues. So why not, you know, bargain on the idea that you may get some hyperplasia from a stretch rather than just doing partials or, you know, really hefty ranges of motion or really hefty cheat form. Just do a nice controlled stretch on your decline bench, get a nice stretch in your biceps on the negative, get more muscle damage, get more, you know, fascia, stretching, which will allow your muscles to bulge more and potentially get some hyperplasia. Next is being able to target all fibers and all the muscles you're trying to train. A good example of this would be a face pull. If you're doing partials on a face pull, you are not going to engage your rear delts. It is not until the end range of the motion, right about here, do you start actually engaging the rear delts. On top of that, good luck feeling your rear delts if you don't squeeze those fuckers. They have such a short range of motion, you have to squeeze them in order to really feel them activate. If you do a partial on a face pull, you're just going to train your mid traps and rhomboids. And that can be fine in other contexts, and again, I'll get to that in a second, but in certain muscle groups, you're not going to be able to hit the fibers you want ideally, if at all, if you don't do a full range of motion. On a squat, personally, I don't know about you guys, but on squats, if I go all the way down and get my knees open with my toes, I get a hell of a lot more muscle damage in my quadriceps. I can't feel my outer head of my quadricep. I can't feel that sweep unless I go below parallel. Because if I could just go to parallel, I just feel my VMO. I just feel my inner head of my quadriceps. I don't feel anything on the outside. And thus I get unideal quad growth because I'm not doing a full range of motion. I also then don't get the standardization. I don't get the safety of having to use less weights because I'm doing a full range of motion versus quarter squats, and I don't get the stretch benefits. So in the case of a squat, full range of motion allows me to target every fiber, every part of the quadriceps, rather than just some of it. And there's so many different examples of this throughout exercise. Not all exercises necessarily need a full range of motion to target every fiber, but the biomechanics of certain joints and the insertions of different muscles might require you to do a full range of motion. Next point is studies. And second thought, I don't think I really want to go over this one because it would be sort of disingenuous of me because I'm not a huge fan of studies a lot of times unless they're overwhelming. And the studies and, you know, white papers and, you know, the science behind full range of motion versus partials and all these different things is kind of gray and muddy. One day someone will say something with a study and it says one thing, the next week it says a totally different thing. I think a lot of training needs to be intrinsic and just logical versus going off the studies. In saying that, there are plenty of studies that will show that full range of motion can be superior to partials or undeniably superior to using, you know, heavy cheat form, but that's just a no-brainer. Next is consistency and regimentation. So really, with this one, if you are a regimented person, you like routine, you like keeping things very similar and not straying from the norm, you like standardization, I think full range of motion is a better option for you. It isn't to say that, you know, partials and other things don't work. Using, you know, cheat form doesn't work. Eric Bugenhagen goes into the gym, you watch this motherfucker train, he just fucking chooses the most random exercise, there's no rhyme or reason, and then he does partials and all kinds of weird shit, and he gets great results. But if for many people, if they were to do that, they would lose their mind. They would not have any consistency of effort, and they would feel, they'd have program anxiety, and you start hopping programs, and you start questioning what you're doing. I personally much prefer being very regimented and routine with my training. Otherwise, I feel like I'm fucking up somehow. Recently, I became a bit more intrinsic with my training. I'm experimenting a little bit just because I'm injured and I'm not worrying about standardization or ranges of motion or anything. And there's probably gains to be had from that too. But I just feel a bit more comfortable personally when I'm consistent and regimented and really just like jotting every little detail down. The last one is kind of a minor point, but it gives you honest strength. Full range of motion with no cheat form will show you exactly where you are. Whereas if you're using momentum, you don't know exactly how strong your biceps are if you're doing a cheat bicep curl versus a wall curl or a strict curl where you sit up against the wall and you just strictly curl it up. You know exactly where your biceps are at. And you're probably less likely to injure yourself when you do 1-rep maxes or strength tests with good form versus, you know, brutal, momentum-based form. And then on top of that, like if you use it, like say, for example, you use machines, that's the most honest version of strength that there is because there's no technical prowess required, which is an oxymoron because I guess part of being a cyborg is being able to use techniques so efficiently that you're like so neurologically adapted, like a powerlifter, for example. They're a bit of a cyborg. You watch a powerlifter, it's all very mechanical and very thought out. But ultimately they are using a lot of momentum and they are using a lot of technique versus just honest grinding strength. So I don't know, that's just one last point I wanted to throw in on the pros. So I couldn't think of anything more. Oh, no, I could. Muscles, not the joints. I didn't even spell that right. But basically I'm saying here, train the muscles, not the joints. So when you use momentum and you horse cock the weight up, as an Eric Bugenhagen would say, you are inherently using more joint and connective tissues. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but from a pure hypertrophy perspective, you can't recover as quick when your joints are taking more strain. Joints, ligaments, tendons have far more blood flow and thus are the limitation for your recovery process to train again. If you want to train biceps on Monday and train again on Friday, if you're using a shit ton of tendons to bicep curl, they are not going to be recovered by Friday. They might only be recovered next week. And that mathematically means less hypertrophy because you can't train as frequently. On top of that, then you're less safe because you're putting all the tension on the joints and ligaments. But really what I'm just saying here is try to train the muscles, not the joints. Try to put all the tension on the muscles and the joints. You get more muscle fiber damage and you get more recovery out of it. All right, now we're onto the cons. So forgive me if I seemingly contradict myself here and there, but I'm going to try and tie these points together because ultimately they are two sides of the one coin. You have an ego lifter who uses too momentum, and then you have an ego lifter who's so fucking dogmatic and so full of themselves. They're like, yeah, I have to do 5 seconds of range of motion on my 965-degree bicep curls, else I am using momentum and I'm not contracting the muscle and I won't make any gains. It's ego on both sides. You need to tie them together. And the first point is beyond failure work. You can't train beyond failure if you're a technique cyborg to the utmost. If you're doing bicep curls to failure, good, do them strict. Figure out the standardized version of your strength. That way you know if you're progressing. Then, when you fail, if you want to go beyond failure, if you're a high intensity guy like me, this might not apply for volume guys, but if this is especially important for high intensity guys, you might not have the option of a drop set, or maybe you don't like drop sets, or maybe you don't have a force rep in a partner, maybe you don't want to do a rest pause. Maybe if some exercises, in my personal opinion, are better if you just use some cheat form after you fail strictly to get more time and attention and more muscle damage after failure, because sometimes mechanical tension to failure doesn't quite cut it. You need a little bit more beyond that point. And for me, when I do bicep curls, I personally just like to fail strict and then let it down. Can't lift it again. Cool. I'm going to use a little bit of low back English to get it up, and then I'm going to do a slow negative on the way down. And I'm not going to count those reps because they're not standardized, but that doesn't matter. It's just an intensity technique. You can't do that if you're a cyborg because you can't do any momentum because you're too absolutely scared of non-optimal form and injuring yourself and stimulus to fatigue ratio and all these scientific words. No, there is a time and place for shitty form, but it's after you failed strict. Next is everything works. Intensity is key. So Ike Israel, Jeff Nippard, they're huge. They're strong. Eric Bugenhagen. I can't think of any bro science guys because I just don't really watch many people, but Eric Bugenhagen being the antithesis of this. He is very bro sciencey. He's even bigger and he's even stronger. This doesn't mean one's better than the other. Eric's just a beast. Point being, everything works. What matters is you train hard or you potentially train to failure. So really, you don't need to worry too much about the cyborg technique, only the things that really matter to you. Next is paralysis by analysis. So like if you are super analytical of your training and every little aspect needs to be perfect, and I'm doing a total full range of motion and I'm doing 69 seconds of negative range of motion and then I'm doing a 50-second positive, like making sure that everything is totally scientific as possible. I don't see the virtue in that. You need to have some fun with your training. You need to have some leeway. You are human. Not every rep is going to be perfectly standardized, but ultimately you can only do your best. And if you're trying to perfect everything, you're never going to perfect it because you're human. Humans aren't perfect. So paralysis by analysis being like the Jeff Nippard approach, where you just fucking everything has to be like nailed down to a science. No, I don't think that's necessarily necessary either. I think again, there's a fine line between being a slow, boring repper and then the polar opposite being the tendon tearing machine who fucking does Zerka backflip bicep curls onto a trampoline, some shit there is some middle ground in the middle where these two ideas meet and everything works so much better. A lot of this shit is fluff and pump crap too. It's like really taking 3 seconds to contract my rhomboids every time I do a cable row to make sure I'm doing an isometric hold. And then it's like, dude, how are you gonna fucking How are you going to use any significant weight at all if you're doing like 5-second negative, like, or like 10-second negatives with like a 5-second static contraction? Like this shit, there is no rhyme and reason to a lot of it. A lot of these like total cyborg form ideas is just marketing gimmicks. It's like really slow rep speeds or totally going fucking the craziest range of motion ever to get almost no benefit, if anything, of the detraction. So there is, again, a fine line. A lot of this stuff is like steroid users who can just get psychoplasmic hypertrophy from really high reps and lots of time and attention with no proximity to failure at all. And that is no good either. You don't want to be overly analytical or overly scientific or overly soft with your training. You need some aggression. Then there's also the difference in contraction, right? Like you could get a fucking pretty good contraction by just retracting your scapula right now. Just pull your shoulders back and you can fucking feel my rear delts and my rhomboids and my lats contracting. And it feels very similar to if I got a very light weight and did the exact same thing. But that's not the right contraction you're looking for here. You're looking for a controlled contraction with heavy weight. I think Dorian Yates, if you go watch Dorian Yates' Blood and Guts training, he perfected the absolute midway between some aggression, a tiny bit of momentum, and a lack of standardization, but ultimately keeping everything tight, but heavy and controlled. There is a different type of contraction when you do a heavy but controlled weight versus like a light, slow, negative, positive nonsense. It doesn't feel right personally. I don't know how to explain it, but there is a difference in feeling when you're lifting a heavy weight with control, but that contraction is real. And it's not like a burning, lactic acid contraction or like a static muscular contraction. It's a fucking, I don't know how to explain it, but hopefully you guys understand what I mean. If you don't, you need to go now then lift a heavy weight with control. Next point, is it really that dangerous to use a little bit of momentum, right? So in the argument of, say, let's say the bicep curl again, right? You do a strict set of bicep curls to failure. This is a weight that you could do strict originally, and thus very apparently your muscles and tendons can take it. Then you do some, momentum work after the fact. You don't think your tendons can still take that weight, your joints can't still take that weight, your muscles can't still take that weight? Of course it can, because it already took that weight strictly. It can for sure take it with some momentum then. Now, granted, you don't want to like use crazy momentum and like fucking stretch your bicep out of the bottom, or do a pec fly where you like doing like a Tom Platz pec fly where you fucking like rip your pec out of the fucking. You want to keep it controlled in the like as controlled as possible in a strict fashion, whilst also simultaneously cheating. But using a little bit of momentum to do a slow controlled negative, or just a bit of momentum to get more weight, is not going to kill you. Going too crazy, using too much momentum, yeah, there's an argument for that. But if you can control the weight strictly, you can most definitely control the weight with a bit of momentum. There's not that much danger in it, especially if you're natural. If you're a natural, you could probably just do shitty form in general and be safe. But will you be standardized and will you be optimal? Probably not. Last thing, I've already kind of covered this originally, but it depends on the muscle. So as I said before, the face pull, for example. On a face pull, you want strict contracted form full range of motion in order to activate it. But the polar opposite is a muscle that starts at the bottom, which is the rhomboids. The rhomboids work incredibly well with a weighted stretch, and the best way to weight stretch any muscle is with a lot of momentum. You fucking stretch the shit out of that muscle at the bottom. The best gains I've ever got in my rhomboids was from really heavy unilateral cheat rows. Now, that would be no good for my biceps from a safety perspective. This would be no good for my rear delts for a contraction perspective. But for my rhomboids, my traps, your calves, these heavy weight bearing, muscles that are really far out of the kinetic chain, your rhomboids are like fucking 6 muscles detached from your hands. It's very difficult to really squeeze and contract that bugger. And if you can, it's probably not going to take much anyway, because it's a heavy weight bearing movement or muscle. Same with the traps. So the traps, you don't see dudes with big traps who do slow, controlled, like movements like that, especially naturals. Maybe dudes on steroids, because steroids, everything fucking works. But naturals typically only get big traps from heavy stretch overload movements like power shrugs, heavy farmer's walks. I mean, strongmen are a good example of that too. Farmer's walks are not strict movements, guys. The farmer's walks is no range of motion, and it is fucking heavy as shit. You're stretching the shit out of your tendons, which goes hand in hand with that stretch idea that I was talking about in the pros. The stretch will happen from strict form a lot of times. It also happens from cheat form. you cheat the fuck out of your cable row, you cheat the fuck out of your power shrugs, you're going to stretch the shit out of the muscles and you're going to get that stretch overload technique. So there is a time and place for both, guys. That's the conclusion. You need to do both. You need to do strict form. You also should try to do some cheat form in certain contexts. I ultimately favor a little bit more on the strict most of the time, but there is most definitely some benefit from a bit of body English, a bit of cheat form, a little bit more partials. Maybe you're doing a bicep curl and a decline curl, and you can't get it all the way up, but you can still tap out the other half of the range of motion. Bam, there you go. That's a good usage of a partial versus full range of motion. But you started with the full range of motion. You started with the strict form. That's the takeaway from here. Start strict, stay standardized to the start. Then after that, when you know you are progressively overloaded, you know you're stronger, then you can get cheated. Then you can go a bit more intrinsic. Then you can do the heavy fucking cable rows for your rhomboids and smaller muscles. But it's a combination. Anyway, until next time, fucking hell, I've been recording for ages. Until next time, see you guys. Bye-bye.